Good afternoon to everyone. I am Faustine Zoveda. I work with FAO and I have the pleasure to welcome you to this online event entitled Disseminating Knowledge and Developing Capacities for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, a task force on best practices, which is organized as one of the many events that will take place during this very exciting week leading to the launch of the UN Decade. So we will spend the next 45 minutes together to discuss knowledge dissemination for ecosystem restoration. We will hear and see a few presentations highlighting the achievements from the FAO-led Task Force on Best Practices, a group focused on capacity development for ecosystem restoration that involves more than 40 organizations worldwide. Before then moving into a panel discussion highlighting current gaps and opportunities for upscaling knowledge actions throughout the decade. Please note that you can type your questions at any time in the chat box, and we will do our best to reply directly in the chat. And the questions that will not be answered live will be addressed on our online community of practice in the following days, and you will find a link to register in the chat. Let me now give the floor to our keynote speaker, Mette Wilkie, Director of the Forestry Division of FAO and co-leader of the UN Decade for FAO, who will open the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faustine, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, depending on where you are. As Faustine was mentioning, we are entering a week of exciting events organized around the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. That's run from 2021 to 2030. The official launch will be on Saturday, the 5th of June, World Environment Day. As part of that, I'd like to just remind you of some very important facts on why we have this decade. That's because ecosystem degradation affects the well-being of over 3.2 billion people worldwide. That's about 40% of the total population. And it costs more than $6 trillion a year. We also know that each year we're losing 10 million hectares of forest through deforestation. That's an area the size of the Republic of Korea, or if we look at Africa, the combined size of Sierra Leone and Equatorial Guinea. We also know that about 13% of the wetlands that were present in the year 1700 remained in the year 2000. And that 1/3 of the global fish stocks are overexploited, up from about 10% in 1974. So it is clear that without large-scale restoration of degraded terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems globally, we cannot achieve the objectives of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is why the UN General Assembly and all the countries in the world came together in March 2019 to allocate this decade and proclaim this decade as the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The overarching aim of this decade is to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of all types of ecosystems worldwide. As part of that, FAO and the United Nations Environment Programme were asked to help initiate and implement this decade. And in 2019 and 2020, we had a lot of consultations that ended up in a strategy for this decade. That strategy has a vision of a world where, for the health and benefits of all life on Earth and that of future generations, the relationship between humans and nature has been restored. The area of healthy ecosystems is increasing, and where ecosystem loss, fragmentation, and degradation has been ended. That's what we want to achieve by 2030. Now, in order to get there, clearly we need to know how to prevent, halt, and reverse ecosystem degradation. And one of the barriers to get to that is the limited technical knowledge and capacities to design, implement, and sustain large-scale ecosystem restoration initiatives. So to address that particular barrier, FAO set up a task force on best practices to look at capacity development, in particularly through the collection and dissemination of good practices. And that's the part of this task force we want to talk about today. So they will also help shape a broad variety of knowledge actions throughout that decade. And as Faustine said, we have more than 40 organizations represented in this task force. In fact, we have more than 100 members, a broad network of experts from all ecosystems around the world. And we welcome new members every day. So if you're interested, let us know. To steer the work of this task force with so many people, its members have jointly designed a roadmap. And the ultimate objective of this roadmap is to make sure that there is a wide range of relevant and quality resources available to everyone, such as good practices, manuals, guidelines, websites, training, and expertise. This session today provides us with an opportunity to introduce 3 key products that have been developed by this task force. Firstly, there is a set of guiding principles for ecosystem restoration that will help us define what ecosystem restoration is, what a good practice is, and what kind of criteria we can use to define a good practice. The second thing we would hear about today are the key findings of a global capacity needs assessment that has been carried out, highlighting current gaps and barriers to achieve restoration goals. So we need to know what's missing. How do we actually help fill those gaps? So that's the second thing. And the third thing we would hear about today is about a template that can help collect and share information on good practices for restoration worldwide throughout the next decade. We also hear some panel discussion on knowledge dissemination, looking at the perspectives, the needs, and the challenges from various stakeholders that are involved in ecosystem restoration across the world. So please join me in learning more about what this task force has already achieved and help us gather and share information and lessons learned on good practices so that we jointly can scale up restoration efforts worldwide. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for this introduction. So as Mette mentioned, in order to identify and share good practices for ecosystem restoration, we need at first to be able to say what ecosystem restoration is. Vera Borger, Senior Land and Water Officer with the Land and Water Division of FAO, who co-leads the Task Force on Best Practices, will share with us the guiding principles for ecosystem restoration, which are the key results from the work of the task force and its partners. Vera.
Thank you very much, Faustine. So as mentioned before, it's not only important to know what we mean by ecosystem restoration, but we also need to understand what a good practice is. So the combination of both was very important for the task force to define. And in view of the lack of common vision, and in order to have a common understanding of what we mean by ecosystem restoration and to be able to define what qualifies as a good practice under the decade of ecosystem restoration, the task force on best practices in partnership with the Society of Ecosystem Restoration and IUCN and other partners and the whole task force led the development of the definition of principles for ecosystem restoration. Please, next slide. So this work started between February and March 2021 by drafting the principles, building on several published principles for restoration activities, which already existed. Then the proposed principles, which are presented today, are the results of a stakeholder consultation, which took place in the framework of the third Global Forum on Ecological Restoration, involving about 70 participants, and followed by a consultation with the Sign Task Force, which had a presentation this morning, and others internally. And after the launch of the decade this week, the principles will be available at the UN Decade webpage for a global consultation, which will end mid-July, sometimes mid-July. And then the final publication incorporating the results of the global consultation will take place during the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille in September 2021. And this will include the descriptions of the 9 principles and the visual identity, which is being designed as well. So already during the 3rd Global Forum in April 2021, we started discussions on defining also the standards of practice for the different principles, including the comments from the global consultation. This work will continue in September 2021. So as mentioned, next slide, please. As mentioned already, the process for defining these principles started with a stock taking of published principles for restorative activities at a global scale, and looking also into multiple biomes and ecosystems. Then these principles came from 15 publications which talked about these principles and were combined thematically to develop the headline principles. These then were presented and discussed at the 3rd Global Forum on ecological restoration, and also the descriptions for each principles were developed and were presented, which are presented today after reviewing the internal feedback, receiving the internal feedback on the headline principles and descriptions. So what are the 9 principles? Principle 1 promotes inclusive and participatory governance, social fairness and equity from the start and throughout the process and outcomes. Actually, this principle looks into involving all relevant stakeholders and right holders with a particular focus on underrepresented groups throughout the whole process right from the beginning, through seeking free and prior informed consent, building dialogue, trust, and mutual respect through inclusive and transparent governance processes, and shared objectives and values. And also recognizing rights, needs, and concern, enhancing tenure, property, and land rights, and ensuring fair and equitable distribution of benefits and responsibilities based on consensus. The second principle includes a continuum of restorative activities. This involves all types of ecosystems that can benefit from ecosystem restoration, including natural, semi-natural, productive, cultural, and urban systems. So major categories of restorative activities include reduction of negative environment and societal impacts, removal of contamination and pollutants, rehabilitation of ecosystem functions and services, and partially or fully returning the ecosystems to the state it would have been if degradation had not occurred. So the third principle aims to achieving the highest level of recovery possible for ecosystems' health and human well-being. Ecosystem restoration should include a wide range of protection, conservation, and recovery activities that should result in net gain both for nature and for people. It also should aim at delivering multiple benefits through nature-based solutions that satisfy the full range of societal challenges and needs currently facing our planet. Principle 4 addresses drivers of ecosystem restoration. Any restorative intervention should address the direct and indirect drivers of ecosystem restoration, degradation, fragmentation, and biodiversity loss in order to have a long-term impact on both the causes and symptoms of ecosystem degradation. Key to this action are efforts at eliminating perverse incentives that promote ecosystem degradation while adopting sustainable management practices. Landscape-wide approaches are paramount, as well as the application of policy instruments known to avoid, reduce, and reverse land degradation, including legal, regulatory, and social and economic dimensions. And Principle 5 incorporates all types of knowledge and promotes the exchange throughout the process. This involves indigenous, traditional, local, scientific, and practitioner knowledge in an integrated way into restoration activity to promote evidence-based decision-making and ensure that interventions are properly tailored to the local context, effectively implemented, and equitably shared. Principle 6 is tailored to the local context while considering the larger landscape or seascape and socioeconomic and cultural settings. That means that ecosystem restoration is undertaken in small areas to large landscapes. Regardless of size, however, both the local and the landscape or seascape must be considered in planning and evaluating in order to align the local context goal with local ecological and social needs. Principle 7 is based on well-defined short and long-term ecological and socioeconomic objectives. When planning a restoration intervention, long-term goals and measurable objectives for milestones must be established, stipulating expected results, magnitude of the change desired, and time frame, as well as a plan for monitoring. And there we're working also with the monitoring task force. Principle 8 plans and undertakes monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management throughout a lifetime of a project or program. So this monitoring of the ecological and socioeconomic and livelihood outcomes of restoration programs and initiatives should be undertaken to understand whether or not these are achieving the objectives and goals. And this should be through adaptive management. So the last principle integrates policies and measures to ensure longevity, maintain funding, and where appropriate, enhance and scale up intervention. Relevant policies, measures, strategies, and plans must be mapped, adopted, and integrated in the design and implementation of multi-sectoral restoration to scale them out and up. So only successful ecosystem restoration projects and programs which are environmentally sustainable and economically viable should have broad influence and higher replicability potential in the long term. These successful initiatives should go beyond localized actions to inform and influence the design of policies and measures at local, national, and global level. So with this, I think I presented the basic ideas behind the 9 principles. Thank you, Faustine. I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vera. And a prerequisite to successful capacity development actions, which encompass but are not limited to good practices and their dissemination, is a clear understanding of capacity needs. Robin Chasdon, who is a researcher and consultant at Forestoration International, as well as an active member of the task force, will share with you the key findings of the Global Online Capacity Needs Assessment Survey that was implemented over the first quarter of 2020 to get a good understanding of critical gaps in that domain.
Thank you very much, Faustine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. On behalf of the Task Force for Best Practices, I will present some of the findings of our recent capacity needs assessment. Next, please. We undertook an assessment of system-wide capacities that need to be enhanced. And by this, we mean considering all different units that are involved in restoration, from individuals to organizations at all scales. This enhancement is important for providing a baseline of existing capacities. So where are we now? To help identify the strengths, gaps, the needs, and the barriers to achieving global restoration goals, and to guide the decade's system-wide capacity development efforts by mainstreaming restoration capacities into regional and national knowledge and learning action plans. We are now at the stage of assessing the results of our global survey, which was responded by 1,331 participants. But the work actually started over a year ago to elaborate the survey, to determine the stakeholder categories, and then we had a consultation in October at the Global Landscape Forum conference. And we also had a pilot testing session during December. And this really helped to refine the final survey, which was conducted from mid-February till the beginning of May. And then in the future, next few months, we'll be elaborating a full report on these findings. Next, please. Out of that total respondents, 65% were male. And they had respondents had a broad distribution by age, with a peak in the 35 to 44-year-old category. Well, we had a very good, we feel that we have a good representation here of different age groups and gender. Next. We also received a very good global response. More than half of the respondents work in Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America, and the Caribbean, with a broad distribution from other areas of the world, and also across many different types of ecosystems. In our respondents, 36% work in forest ecosystems, but we have a good representation of other types of ecosystems, although there's a very low number of respondents who work with oceans and coasts, and this is something we would like to supplement in our work. Next. We directly asked whether respondents had access to professional capacity development, and this was important for us to understand what kinds of training capacities there are and what kind of training programs are already in place and that people have access to. And we discovered that a fairly large fraction of professionals do not have access to any capacity development within their region. The regions that had the greatest access were Mediterranean and Middle East, and Latin America and the Caribbean. But the regions that had the lowest access to professional capacity development were Africa and Europe and Central Asia. So this indicates there's considerable scope for improving access to professional capacity development programs. Next. We also asked respondents to identify what stakeholder group they represent. And this was important because we had particular questions about capacity development and capacity needs that were oriented toward different stakeholder groups. 55% of the respondents work with government or NGOs at the national and international level. So we really did reach that level of professional. And 11% work at the local and subnational governmental level. We also have a good number of respondents who work with research and education, 17%, and 12% of the respondents are land users or small scale producers or involved in community groups. Only 5% of the respondents work in the finance sector. Next. And that helps to inform the specific major gaps that I'm going to discuss now. We looked at these within each of the stakeholder categories. And one thing that we see here is that there was considerable overlap between the government and NGOs that work at the international or national scale and those that work at the local or subnational scale. This indicates that there are some priority areas that can be for capacity development that can achieve the goals of both of these groups. In particular, the need to engage more actors in restoration from different sectors that are not yet very engaged, such as the mining and energy sector, marine sector, finance sector, and private sector. Also, the need to really work on capacity for improving policies and actions to improve equitable access to markets for local communities and to improve land and resource ownership and tenure rights. And also on the implementation side to improve supply and value chains and markets. There were some differences though. The national and international levels emphasized the need to build capacity to mobilize finance for restoration, whereas the local and subnational levels emphasized the need to build capacity for planning and for monitoring. The respondents in research and education emphasized the need to build capacity for assessing the costs and benefits of degradation and restoration, and for developing decision support tools, models, and guidelines, including guidelines for bankable business and business models, equitable cost and benefit sharing models, and predictive spatial models. Also, the need to enhance capacity and support services and to provide capacity for inclusive, gender responsive, and harmonized extension programs. Next. The investor sector and private sector emphasized the importance of building capacity for sustainable financing for restoration and long-term funding mechanisms. Also for creating innovative financing solutions and risk-sharing mechanisms and improving access to funding by communities and marginalized and grassroots organizations. And finally, managing investment risks, including measures to mitigate risk and better requirements for funding. And again, bankable business plans and business models. It's coming up in several places. Finally, the land user and community interest groups emphasize the importance of building capacity for mobilizing finance for community level restoration activities, implementation and monitoring of community-based restoration activities, which include resolving land use conflicts and strengthening geographic boundaries. And finally, improving organizational capacity development and engagement. So that concludes my brief summary of our report, and stay tuned for our final report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robin, for this great overview. And so let's now move to the panel discussion and hear more from our panelists about the current needs and opportunities they see for reinforcing capacities on ecosystem restoration. And for that purpose, we have the pleasure to welcome 5 panelists. And these are Rose Akombo, head of the Climate Change Unit and coordinator of the Forest and Landscape Restoration Initiatives in Kenya from the Kenya Forest Service. Gam Shimre, who is the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. Dr. Bose Hancock, who is Senior Marine Habitat Restoration Scientist with the Nature Conservancy. Dr. Tatenda Lehman, who is Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Development and Environment and member of the executive team of the World Overview of Conservation Approaches and Technologies, also known as WOCAT. And finally, Christophe Bezassier, who is Senior Forestry Officer with the Forest and Landscape Restoration Mechanism, a program hosted by the Forestry Division of FAO. And so, Rose, my first question is for you. So Rose, through their national and international commitments, governments made strong pledges to restore degraded ecosystems at country level. In 2016, Kenya pledged to restore 5.1 million hectares to the Bond Challenge, a global aspiration to restore degraded forests and landscapes. What are the current gaps in terms of capacities, and how do you expect the decade to accelerate capacity development?
Thank you, Faustine, for giving me the floor, and thank you for that question. I have the honor to share the capacity needs for Kenya in regards to ecosystem restoration, knowledge dissemination on behalf of Kenya Forest Service and the Ministry of Environment, Forestry that coordinates forest and landscape restoration efforts in the country. Kenya Forest Service acknowledged the work that has been done by the task force on best practices and the key findings that have been presented today on the Global Capacity Assessment Needs Assessment Survey, which we participated on. In Kenya, we have identified 4 capacity gaps that must be addressed to scale up ambitious restoration efforts by government, partners, private sector, and all stakeholders. The first capacity gaps is on governance and institutional coordination for efficient conservation, management, and ecosystem restoration. As you all know, Kenya adopted a devolved government system as required by the Constitution 2010, and the Constitution recommended that most landscape-related functions have been transferred to the county governments for implementation. However, there is limited technical capacity and budget allocation at the county level to be able to coordinate and implement restoration-related policies and action. The second capacity gap is on monitoring, tracking, and reporting restoration efforts in the country, as the current technologies, tools, and frameworks available are insufficient to facilitate real-time measurement and tracking of changes in the ecosystem. The third gap identified is on limited capacity to cutting-edge research and tools that will give evidence-based results to influence the uptake of restoration intervention in different ecosystems in the country. And finally, the financial gap. Currently, there is limited capacity to develop bankable investment packages on ecosystem restoration that are competitive enough and generate tangible revenues compared to other alternative land uses to promote restoration activities. How do we envisage the opportunities presented by the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration to help us address this. We are optimistic that through the support from the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, we will be able to strengthen the governance system and institutional coordination at county and landscape level. Secondly, we'll be able to support the development of an integrated framework for monitoring, tracking, and reporting progress with very clear common indicators and associated metrics. We are also looking forward to strengthening the collaboration of research and knowledge management to promote research and knowledge dissemination of best practices informed by science, just as some of them have been shared with us. And finally, we are looking forward at the opportunities presented to establish a proper funding mechanism accessible to countries, and also to develop platforms to link private sectors with local potential investment opportunities. As Kenya Forest Service, we are supporting the government in developing a forest and landscape restoration implementation plan 2021-2025 to address the identified capacity gaps and scale up restoration of 2.5 million hectares by 2025 and 5.1 million hectares by 2030. We therefore seek technical and financial support from governments, partners, private sectors, and all stakeholders in the country and across the globe to address these capacity gaps and accelerate the achievement of our national aspiration of achieving 10% tree cover and international obligation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose, for highlighting and sharing those gaps and those opportunities that reflect very much the ones that we have already pre-identified as results of the global capacity needs assessment. Let me now revert to Mr. Gam Shimray to look at another angle. Integrating all the sources of knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, will be key to achieve the ambition of the UN Decade and restore all ecosystems for the benefit of all people. So my question is twofold. How can the decade recognize and value indigenous knowledge? And how can capacity development actions be better tailored to the needs of indigenous people? Thank you.
Thank you, and greetings to all of you. I think, first of all, it is very important to recognize that local and community institutions and organizations are where the need for restoration action originates and where the capacity, motivation, and local knowledge for effective restoration actions reside. And indigenous knowledge and wisdoms are built on in-depth knowledge of ecosystems and reciprocal relationship with the surrounding nature. So if our solution is to build a culture of restoration and living in reciprocity with the surrounding nature, indigenous knowledge and wisdoms are one of the building blocks that we cannot ignore. And of course, integrating all sources of knowledge is important because ecosystem restoration is a multidisciplinary activity that can be promoted through many different approaches and rely on different types of knowledge. This means that indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and scientific knowledge are equally vital and must be well integrated and harmonized. The problem is that the critical information that exists are not documented and not available to decision makers. So this is an area of gap to be filled and capacity to be built. Further capacity building initiatives that focus on applying knowledge to practice can be an important step towards creating enabling conditions for restoration. And in all this, I think it is important to look at a holistic approach to restoration. And one of them is the biocentric restoration, which is an inclusive model for restoration and conservation rooted in indigenous peoples' food systems, ancestral knowledge, and territorial management and practices. These models also ensures how indigenous rights would be protected. It is this kind of models where sustainable food systems that includes production, generation, and conservation are integrated. It is an approach where different land use practices within a given territory of the community complement and interact, allowing production and generation and restoration. So it is important to look out for this kind of workable models and see where the capacity buildings are required. But some of it is, of course, the importance, the governance capacity, whether it's of the governments and also of the local communities. And documentation for co-creation of knowledge and innovations are areas where we need a lot of capacity building so that trust is built and there is a collective action going on there. And I will end by saying this, that underlying all these is the recognition of the rights of our right to our land, territories, and resources, and recognizing that communities are agents of change, and that collective actions need to be enabled and capacity needs to be built for collective action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And still looking at communities and pursuing this thinking, looking at who supports as well on daily basis communities, we would like to hear the perspective from an NGO. And so both, my question is for you. NGOs are a fantastic catalyst for knowledge dissemination to communities in particular. And from your experience, what are the needs in terms of knowledge tools, products, and approaches to accelerate the uptake of good practices on the ground?
Thank you very much, Faustine. Okay, well, I will try to represent the many diverse groups that are involved in restoration and speak more specifically to the marine restoration, which is my expertise. And there are examples of marine ecosystem restoration that go back many, many decades, but it's generally a younger field than in the terrestrial realm. And most of the urgency that has developed around marine habitat restoration or marine ecosystem restoration has really done so this century, just in the last couple of decades. But during those couple of decades, the communities of practice have developed and expanded considerably. The marine realm is almost exclusively public space. There is really no private ownership in the marine realm, and that's forced restoration practitioners to work with diverse groups, including a very deliberate process of planning and negotiation for permits with regulators, a lot of public consultation and engagement, and monitoring and reporting of the results back to regulatory bodies. So that has tended to favor a fairly rapid progression, I think, of marine habitat restoration from an academic sphere to the NGOs and increasingly corporate partners in recent years. But in the marine realm, most of the restoration networks that have developed have tended to focus on a single ecotype. And the ecotypes or habitats of focus have generally been those critical coastal ecosystems, the vegetated ecosystems such as salt marsh, seagrass, mangrove, and a developing focus on giant kelps. And along with the vegetated ecosystems, the reef systems, those critical shellfish reefs and coral reefs. So there have been networks of restoration practitioners developed around each. And examples of those would be organizations or groups like the Global Mangrove Alliance, a very deliberate collaboration of NGOs and organizations initiated by the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, and IUCN, and Wetlands International, and with a number of other organizations joining in more recent years: World Conservation Service, Zoological Society of London, Rare, Blue Ventures. It's become a very encompassing network of practitioners and information dissemination based on mangrove restoration. Coral Reef is another good example. The International Coral Reef Initiative and the Coral Reef Consortium are both focused very intensely on restoring coral reefs. A lot of that work started in the US and Caribbean and very quickly expanded to include Australia, Southeast Asia, Red Sea, and East Africa. So again, a competent network focused on one ecotype. Similarly, shellfish restoration has tended to be focused more on a regional scale. So there is a China and Hong Kong network, an Australia and New Zealand network, a European network, and a US network, with regional conferences for sharing information, and also an international conference for knowledge dissemination. And those networks have tended to focus on the major outputs that have been discussed in terms of best practices. So developing those best practices, providing knowledge dissemination, providing monitoring guidelines, setting goals, addressing bottlenecks to restoration. But I think the decade and the focus and support from the decade of ecological restoration has the potential to really benefit those groups of marine habitat restoration practitioners in a few fairly discrete ways. Just focusing the attention on the importance of marine ecosystems for a start is hugely beneficial. It is a far less recognized but very important component of ecological restoration, and helping to build bridges between those specific networks would also be of huge benefit, as well as supporting the individual networks and their attempts to disseminate and store and make available the monitoring data. So I hope that addresses your question, Faustine, but thank you very much for the opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much for this perspective on the role of networks, and also how could these networks benefit further from the decade. So the next question goes to Tatenda Lehman. And here, what I'd like to hear from you, Tatenda, is, well, for more than 25 years now, WCAT has identified, consolidated, and diffused good practices for sustainable land management and restoration of terrestrial ecosystems. So why will such a role be critical over the decade to come?
Thanks a lot, Faustine, and greetings to all of you also from WCAT. As we have learned earlier today, knowledge remains one of the key limiting factors for the implementation of good practices. Of course, beside other elements such as access to financial resources or a supportive legal environment. But those stakeholders who are putting restoration into action need not only easy access to latest knowledge, but also be able to share their success, challenges, but maybe also failures with each other. There is so much we can learn from one another within and between countries, regions, or even continents. Knowledge on good practices is usually shared within, between projects and institutions, or in science policy practice interfaces. But however, after initial sharing, a lot of valuable expertise are then placed in a bookshelf, as we would say in old times, or deposited somewhere online on a database or platform, which might be difficult to access. So how can we build on and valorize actually what is already there? WCAT has made experience that there is a high readiness to invest in sharing good practices. The open access WCAT Global Sustainable Land Management Database contains standardized and consistent details from now over 2,000 sustainable land management good practices from more than 130 countries. And it counts actually visitors from every country around the globe. It is the UNCCD primary recommended database for SLM best practices, and it provides proven lessons that direct support the generation restoration global movement of the new UN decade to put restoration into action. But what is important to emphasize is that the foundation to share good practices lies in the following: that those who share are acknowledged for their efforts and are also visible, that those who share can be contacted by others who would like to learn from them, that those who share knowledge, that the shared knowledge is not perceived to belong to one or several institutions only, and that there is no top-down process by few individuals or institutions to identify what is good or what is best, but that principles are co-developed in a participatory, inclusive process. Under the new UN decade, WCAT really remains committed to offer a platform for sharing and disseminating knowledge on good practices. We are excited to support the global restoration movement and to help create a generation restoration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have 10 years to build a generation restoration and beyond. So my last question goes to Christophe. What can the task force and beyond the task force, the decade and its partners offer to help disseminate the knowledge needed to restore our degraded ecosystems and build that generation restoration?
Thank you very much, Faustine, for the question. First, building on the key findings of the capacity need assessment online survey presented a few minutes ago, the task force will finalize its analysis and prepare an action plan on knowledge and learning in order to fill the remarkable gaps identified with the different stakeholder groups. In this action plan, a short list of new flagship products will be identified. The task force will facilitate the elaboration of these new flagship knowledge products. It will be thematic e-learning courses, new or updated curricula on ecosystem restoration, capacity building, knowledge sharing tools well adapted to the need of the multiple stakeholders and to the different types of ecosystems. This new flagship product should be elaborated with the idea to fill key following gaps already presented by Wim: mobilization of finance for restoration with innovative financing solution, support to the preparation of bankable projects through incubators and landscape accelerators, etc. Development of relevant policies with a particular focus on supply chains, value chains with high potential for ecosystem restoration, but also on tenure issues, land rights. Development and dissemination of decision support tools and guidelines on ecosystem restoration, monitoring methods and approaches in partnership with the FAO-led monitoring task force and the FEM platform in preparation with our colleagues in FAO, the monitoring task force led by Julian Fox, and development of knowledge sharing and good practices platforms. In terms of approach, the task force will focus its effort on collection, capitalization, and dissemination of knowledge and good practices within the multiple ecosystem restoration communities of practices. Of course, we are not starting from scratch, so we will promote access to knowledge and practices already collected in the context of existing platforms, such as WCAT, but also Panorama or the International Coral Reef Initiatives, all the different identified interesting platforms. But nevertheless, building on the momentum of the decade, the task force will try to upscale this effort of collection of new good promising practices according to a pre-agreed and harmonized template already prepared and endorsed within the task force and made available through the Decade Digital Hub and other partner websites. To achieve this ambitious goal, to increase the access to the relevant knowledge and to the relevant good practices, a huge collective effort is required. So I would strongly encourage all partners, restoration practitioners, to not only ask themselves what the decade or the task forces can do for me, but to think about what can I do for the task force or for the decade. And one simple and easy way to make a difference for any restoration practitioner would be to share its knowledge, experiences, promising or recognized good practices to fill the huge community of practices engaged on ecosystem restoration. Thank you for your attention, and over to you, Faustine.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for sharing these perspectives on the future work of the task force and also on the role that each of us have to play to make sure that the decade succeeds. So thank again to all of the speakers and panelists, and of course to the participants for your participation. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Eduardo Mansour, who is the director of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at FAO and co-leader of the UN Decade, who will conclude and close this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faustine. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. And it was a great learning. It was a great opportunity for us to learn from all of you and interact. There's a number of questions in the chat, the box that you have accompanied. These questions are going to be addressed by email. Time is beating us. We should have closed by now. So I'm going to be quick, but there are some points that I would like to emphasize because I learned during this event and I would like to share with you. One of the questions that puzzled me is the one that aren't we reinventing the wheel? Aren't we talking about things that we are already doing? Look, the whole point here is the scale, because degradation is beating the conservation and the restoration and the sustainable land use. And we have to revert this path. We cannot come up with the end of the decade saying that we continue degrading lands for different reasons, including for food production. And we should also change the focus on not only conserving, but sustainably using, on having production ecosystems more sustainable. So, and not only looking at the land, but looking also at the seascapes that we can restore. So I think the whole point here is learning, sharing, and upscaling. The UN Decade is a movement, and this task force on best practices is a way of giving elements for it to happen at scale. So the key findings of the global capacities, the perspectives that have been shared by the panelists, and you saw that the panelists represent different ways of doing restoration, from governments, from indigenous peoples, from international organizations, from NGOs. They underline these gaps that are preventing restoration to happen at the scale that you want. Sometimes it's not the knowledge, but the financial mobilization, the ways of monitoring, tracking systems, the decision support tools, the integration, the documentation, the traditional knowledge, for instance, through our globally important agricultural heritage sites, or from indigenous knowledge that we all know about, but we don't know enough, and we don't have a port of call to go there and learn and disseminate. Our efforts for dissemination are part of this task force. The development of policies that support restoration, the promoting sustainable financing for restoration. These are critical gaps that the decade needs to address to have the scale that we need to reach, you name it, 1 billion hectares of restored landscapes and seascapes by the end of the decade. The UN Decade is the task force now is a coalition of different members representing different institutions. I understood from the colleagues, so we have 123 members from 46 leading global organizations in this task force. We have other task force, as it has been explained. We are talking here about the best practice one. And they try to address exactly these gaps that I have mentioned, looking at two main directions. The key principles that have been presented by Vera today, they respond to this lack of comprehensive, diverse guidance for ecosystem restoration. The principles are critical to share a common vision to help clarify what qualifies a restored ecosystem, because we don't want to return everything to the pristine stage. We want them to be sustainable for the generations to come. We cannot give to the generations to come a land that is worse than the one that we receive. On the contrary, we have to give it in a better condition for sustainable production and sustainable lives. We know how important it is for healthy lives. And the good practice of ecosystem management and ecosystem restoration are a key for this. So the second point that we need to look at is the results of the capacity needs assessment to help developing, scaling up the priority knowledge products, the capacity development initiatives, focus on addressing these gaps that I have just mentioned to you. So knowledge gained through implementation of restoration programs and projects must be capitalized, shared to avoid repeating mistakes, to replicate successful experience, to improve impact. To respond to these needs and complement existing capitalization efforts, this task force has developed the framework for exchange and dissemination of good practices for ecosystem restoration to boost, to scale up the current and the future efforts for restoration across different ecosystems, across different regions. The task force on best practice is extremely pleased to invite restoration experts, practitioners to submit good practice, to share with us what you learned from your projects, from your programs, from initiatives, from all types of ecosystems, from all scales. I'm convinced that people who have news, they want to tell news. Those who have secret, normally because they don't have news. So if you have news to tell about ecosystem restoration, preventing, halting, or restoring degraded areas, returning to productive capacity, returning to biodiversity conservation, returning to water and soil conservation, returning to biodiversity conservation, I already repeated, please share with us. We are delighted to share with you for the first time today the template that has been developed for submission. The objective of template is to not only to, it's to give a way of interpreting it together. It's not to frame or to limit, but to give the possibility of interpretation and aggregation. So the template is going to be shared with you for the compilation of this best practice. You can access it on the link that the colleagues are going to make available here on the screen and also share on the chat. And an expert group will review your submissions as good practice to be selected based on the guiding principles that have been discussed and disseminated. Once approved, of course, they will be displayed on the platforms, on the website of the associated with the decade, the website of the decade. So successful experiences will be easily transferred to other situations to reach similar goals. We encourage you to leverage all the great existing efforts for sharing and dissemination of good practices already initiated by many of us. We have here Tatenda representing WOCAT. I think you know that WOCAT celebrated this year 29 years of experience. It's a lot. I mean, there is a lot there. Let's try to build from this. And there are other relevant platforms that can easily be accessed through the UN Decade website. It's not about creating a new movement. It's about scaling up existing initiatives, fantastic initiatives like WOCAT, like the other ones presented here. So to close, is your organization interested in joining the task force on best practices? Are you interested to join? So global leading organizations in the field of knowledge, capitalization, dissemination are welcome to join the task force on a voluntary basis, contributing to achievement of the outputs of the task force and the outputs of the decade. Just send us a request to the D group platform of the task force, mention your organization, mention you'd like to collaborate with the task force. You can find the link for this request on the chat. It will continue going to be disseminated amongst the participants of this event. And I'm delighted then to say that I learned a lot and I would like to continue this interaction with you. Thank you very much, Faustine. Thank you very much for the panelists, for Mete, my co-leader from FAO side, for the implementation of the decade on ecosystem restoration together with our sister agents, UNEP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and thanks to all of our great speakers and panelists. Thank you to all of the participants, and we hope to stay in touch. I see several requests to join the task force. Here is the link in the chat, as Eduardo just said. And well, I think, Caterina, you wanted to have a view of all of our speakers, of our great panelists today. So here we are all. And we say a very nice goodbye to everybody, and we stay in touch. Thank you.